He was Hitler's favorite general. The Desert Fox. A man so respected that even his enemies admired him. But when the war ended, his widow was left with almost nothing, a pension stripped away, a son haunted by his father's name, and a secret so dangerous that speaking it out loud could have gotten them all killed. This is the story the history books skip over. What really happened to the Rommel family after the guns went silent? Erwin Rommel wasn't like most Nazi generals. He didn't run death camps. He didn't massacre civilians. British soldiers who fought against him in the scorching deserts of North Africa actually called him brilliant, with genuine respect. Winston Churchill stood up in the British Parliament in 1942 and said, in front of everyone, "We have a very daring and skillful opponent against us, and may I say across the havoc of war, a great general." That almost never happened. An enemy leader praising the man trying to defeat them. But Rommel was different. He was a soldier's soldier. Born in 1891 in a small town in southern Germany called Heidenheim, Rommel grew up the son of a schoolteacher. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't connected. He earned everything through sheer talent and nerve. By World War I, he was already winning medals for bravery that shocked his commanding officers. He had a gift, an instinct for the battlefield that couldn't be taught. And by the time World War II erupted, Hitler knew it. He handed Rommel command of the Afrika Korps and turned him loose in the desert. But here is the thing about Rommel that would ultimately destroy him, and almost destroy his family. He was loyal to Germany. He was not loyal to Hitler. And in 1944, those two things were no longer the same. Lucie Rommel was a quiet, dignified woman. She had married Erwin in 1916, right in the middle of the First War, and she knew what it meant to be a soldier's wife. Long silences. Empty chairs at the dinner table. Worry that never quite went away. By the summer of 1944, that worry had become something else entirely. Something colder. Erwin Rommel had seen enough. He had watched Hitler throw away German lives on orders that made no military sense. He had seen the direction the war was heading. And he had, quietly, cautiously, begun talking to officers who were part of a conspiracy, a plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler himself. Rommel didn't want Hitler killed, according to some accounts. He wanted him arrested, put on trial, forced to answer for what he had done to Germany and to Europe. But he knew about the plot. And in Hitler's world, knowing was the same as doing. On July 17, 1944, just 3 days before the famous assassination attempt known as the July 20th plot, Rommel's staff car was strafed by British aircraft in France. He suffered a massive skull fracture. He was rushed to a hospital, barely alive. His family was notified. His teenage son, Manfred, was in the military himself by then, serving as an anti-aircraft gunner. The family held their breath. Rommel survived. He was sent home to recover. And for a few weeks, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, things would be all right. Then the Gestapo came knocking. The July 20th plot had failed. The bomb had gone off. Hitler had lived. And now the SS was hunting everyone connected to the conspiracy with a savagery that terrified all of Germany. Names were being extracted under torture. Files were being combed. And Rommel's name kept appearing. On October 14, 1944, 2 senior German generals arrived at the Rommel family home in Herlingen, a small village in southwestern Germany. Lucie watched them arrive. Manfred, who was home on leave, was in the house too. The generals asked to speak to Erwin alone. What they told him was simple and brutal. Hitler knew. There were 2 choices. Stand trial before the People's Court, a kangaroo court where the verdict was always death, and where the trial itself would be used to humiliate Germany's most famous general on a world stage. Or take a cyanide capsule. Die quietly. Be given a state funeral. Be called a hero. And this was the part that mattered most to Rommel. His family would be protected. Lucie would receive her pension. Manfred would not be arrested. They would be safe. Rommel asked for 15 minutes. He went upstairs. He put on his Afrika Korps jacket. He said goodbye to Lucie and Manfred. He told them what was happening. He told them he had no choice. He walked out to the car. 15 minutes later, he was dead. The German government announced that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had died of wounds sustained on the battlefield in France. It was a lie, of course. But it was a lie that Germany desperately needed. Hitler gave him a state funeral. Flags flew at half-staff. Lucie received a massive wreath with a card signed personally by the Führer, the same man who had murdered her husband. She had to stand there and accept it. She had to grieve in public for a death she could not explain, for a murder she could not name, while the murderer sent flowers. That moment, Lucie Rommel standing silent and dignified at her husband's funeral, receiving condolences from the man who killed him, is one of the most quietly devastating scenes of the entire war. And the secret had to stay buried. Lucie knew the truth. Manfred knew the truth. And they could not speak it. Not yet. Because the war wasn't over. And the Gestapo was still watching. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the Rommel family emerged from the rubble of Nazi Germany into a world that was deeply complicated for them. On one hand, Erwin Rommel's reputation as a clean general, one who hadn't participated in war crimes, gave the family a kind of protection that most families connected to the Nazi regime didn't have. The Allies weren't hunting Lucie. They weren't putting Manfred on trial. The family name, paradoxically, was still respected. But respected doesn't mean comfortable. And it certainly doesn't mean easy. Lucie Rommel was left a widow at 52 in a country that had been bombed into ruins. The pension that Hitler's regime had promised her, the payoff for her silence, the price of her husband's dignified death, was initially honored by the Nazi government in its final months. But when Germany surrendered and the new West German government began sorting out the wreckage, things got complicated. Lucie had to fight for her widow's pension. She had to navigate a bureaucracy that was simultaneously trying to distance itself from everything Nazi while also working out what obligations it owed to the families of men who had served the Nazi state. It was an ugly, painful process. She spent years in quiet financial difficulty, living modestly, relying on Manfred and on the slowly growing public interest in her husband's story. She spoke carefully when she spoke at all. She was protective of Erwin's memory. She knew the full truth of what had happened, the conspiracy, the coercion, the forced suicide, but for years she navigated a careful line between honoring him and protecting herself and her son. Lucie Rommel died in 1971. She was 79 years old. She outlived the war by 26 years. 26 years of carrying a secret that the whole world eventually learned, but that she had to live with in silence for so long. If Lucie's story is one of quiet endurance, Manfred Rommel's story is something else entirely. It is, in many ways, one of the most extraordinary second-act stories to come out of World War II. Manfred was 15 years old when his father died. He had been serving as an anti-aircraft gunner, a child soldier in the truest sense, because the Nazi regime was so desperate by late 1944 that it was drafting teenagers. He watched his father say goodbye. He stood at the state funeral and kept the secret. He was 16 years old, and carrying a weight that would have crushed most adults. After the war, Manfred had to rebuild from absolute zero. The Rommel name was famous, but famous in 1945 Germany was not necessarily an advantage. It meant scrutiny. It meant that everything you did was watched. It meant that your father's choices, your father's associations, your father's life, were constantly being examined and re-examined by historians, journalists, politicians, and ordinary Germans trying to make sense of what their country had done. Manfred chose a path of almost aggressive normalcy. He studied law. He joined the Free Democratic Party, one of the new democratic parties of West Germany, a deliberate choice to plant himself firmly on the side of the new Germany, not the old one. He worked his way up through local government in the state of Baden-Württemberg. And then, in 1974, something happened that would have been absolutely unimaginable just 30 years earlier. Manfred Rommel was elected Lord Mayor of Stuttgart. Stuttgart, one of Germany's great cities. Nearly 600,000 people. And they chose the son of Hitler's favorite general to lead them, not despite his name, but in some ways because of what he had made of it. He served as Lord Mayor of Stuttgart for an astonishing 24 years, from 1974 to 1996. He became known as a progressive, humane, thoughtful leader. He was famous for his sharp wit. He was famous for his genuine decency. He built relationships with Jewish communities. He fostered reconciliation between Germany and its former enemies. He was, by any measure, a remarkable public servant. In 1978, he did something that stunned people. When thousands of Iranian refugees fleeing the revolution began arriving in Germany, Manfred Rommel opened Stuttgart's doors to them. He pushed for their acceptance at a time when many German cities were turning them away. The son of the desert fox, standing up for refugees. History moves in strange directions. He also worked hard to clarify his father's legacy, to separate the genuine military record from the Nazi mythology that had been built around it. He spoke openly about the forced suicide. He corrected the record. He was honest about the complexity of his father's choices in a way that was neither defensive nor self-flagellating. It was simply honest. Manfred Rommel died in 2013 at the age of 84. The tributes that poured in from across Germany and Europe described him as one of the finest mayors Stuttgart ever had. Angela Merkel sent condolences. The city mourned genuinely. But the Rommel legacy in the decades after the war was never simple, and it's important not to romanticize it. Even as Manfred built his career and Lucie protected her husband's memory, historians were asking hard questions. Was Erwin Rommel really the good general the myth made him? The honest answer is, mostly, but not entirely. Rommel did not participate in the Holocaust. His Afrika Korps did not massacre Jewish civilians or execute prisoners of war in the way that the SS routinely did. British and American veterans who fought against him consistently testified to his professionalism and his adherence to the rules of war in the Desert Campaign. That part of the legend holds up. But Rommel also served Hitler loyally for most of the war. He used forced labor in his construction projects in France. There is evidence that he knew about, and did not actively resist, some of the darker aspects of the regime for a long time. His opposition to Hitler came late. It came when the war was clearly lost. And some historians have argued, with reason, that the good general narrative was partly constructed after the war, by the British, who needed a noble enemy to justify their own struggle, and by West Germany, which needed heroes who could be salvaged from the wreck of the Nazi period. The truth, as always, is somewhere in the middle. Rommel was a man of genuine courage and genuine military brilliance who served a monstrous regime until he couldn't anymore. That's not a clean story. That's a human story. For decades, Germany treated Rommel as a kind of special case, a Wehrmacht general who could be honored without dishonoring the memory of the Holocaust's victims. Because he had been murdered by Hitler himself, because he was implicated in the resistance, because the Allied soldiers who fought him had respected him. There are streets named after Rommel in Germany. There is a Rommel museum in Herrlingen, near the house where he died. His grave in the village cemetery of Herrlingen became a pilgrimage site, visited by German veterans, by British veterans, by historians, by tourists. But in recent years, that consensus has started to fracture. In 2019 and into the early 2020s, cities and towns across Germany began debating whether streets named after Rommel should be renamed. The same reckoning with history that swept across the United States, the debates over Confederate monuments, over what names should grace public spaces, arrived in Germany too, and Rommel was caught up in it. Some cities decided to keep the names, arguing that Rommel's resistance to Hitler and his clean record in Africa justified the honor. Others argued that honoring any Wehrmacht general, no matter how clean, was inappropriate in a modern democracy still reckoning with the Holocaust. The debate is ongoing. It is uncomfortable. It is exactly the kind of argument that healthy democracies need to have. Erwin and Lucie had one son, Manfred. But the war generation's losses echoed across families in ways that went beyond direct casualties. Manfred married Lieselot in 1954. They had a daughter, Catherine Rommel, born in 1966. Catherine grew up with the Rommel name in a Germany that was still working out what that name meant. She became a businesswoman and stayed largely out of the public eye, a private person in a family that history refused to leave alone. The name continued to carry weight. In interviews over the years, people in Stuttgart would talk about Manfred Rommel with a warmth that was genuine and unperformed. He was their mayor. He was their neighbor. He was the man who showed up at community events and made sharp jokes and cared about the city. The fact that his father had been Field Marshal Rommel was almost secondary. He had made his own name. That, in the end, might be the most remarkable thing about the Rommel family's post-war story. They didn't hide. They didn't flee to Argentina like so many Nazi-connected families. They didn't change their name. They stayed. They built. They contributed. They faced the weight of history head-on and did something constructive with it. Think about Lucie Rommel standing at that funeral, receiving a wreath from the man who murdered her husband, keeping her face calm, keeping the secret buried. She did it because Erwin had asked her to. Because the alternative was worse. Because sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is endure. Erwin Rommel's grave in Herlingen bears a simple headstone. No swastika. No Nazi imagery. Just his name, his rank, and his dates. 1891 to 1944. 53 years old. His wife buried nearby. His son went on to lead one of Germany's great cities with honor and decency. History doesn't always give us clean heroes and clean villains. Sometimes it gives us something harder, a family trying to survive the wreckage of choices made in impossible times, and finding, against all odds, a way to build something worth being proud of. That's the story of the Rommels. And it deserves to be told.